I think when we told our readers that we're going to interview you, and then we got lots of responses, and we have lots of questions for you. Shall we conduct the interview in Chinese? 我们用中文做可以吗？
其实我想最好还是用英文。
Okay, we'll do.
英文比我的中文好多了。
你的中文是很好的。
不是
We'll do the interview in English.
Okay, that's good.
Great. By the way, where did you learn your Chinese? Did you learn Chinese in college?
No, when I was in college, there were no departments of Chinese. I was at a small liberal arts college. So I began studying Chinese after I got my master's degree at the University of California, Berkeley, and continued studying it off and on.
Off and on. But you visit China quite often,
Yes,
right?
yes. So I also studied Chinese in China at Peking Normal University.
Oh, Peking Normal University. Wow.
And I also, most of my research is based on interviews with Chinese people. So just by listening to their stories, I listen to Chinese much better than I speak it.
Wow. Yeah, you describe your role in the book something like a listener.
Right.
Remember, you once said that you are like the narrating Iris Murdoch's book, The Philosopher's Pupil.
Right.
And then your goal in life is to listen to the stories of Chinese people and write it down in a way that makes sense to both Americans and the Chinese, right? All Westerners and the Chinese.
That's exactly right.
So how do you achieve that? Let's use Chimamau's Physician as an example. How did you get involved in the book?
Well, I got involved in that book by accident. I came home one afternoon when I was living in New York, and there was a voicemail on my telephone from Andrew Nathan, who's a very well-known, famous, respected professor of political science at Columbia University. And he said that I was about to get a call from the senior editor at Random House, whose name was Jason Epstein, with an offer that he hoped I would not refuse, and I better talk to Andy first. So I called Andy. No, I didn't call Andy, because the editor had already called me and left. The second message on my machine was a message from Jason Epstein, who was the senior editor and vice president of Random House, asking me to call him. So first I called Andy, then I called Jason Epstein. And what he said is that he had recently received a manuscript from a man who claimed to be Chairman Mao's personal physician for the last 22 years of his life. And if he really was what he said he was, and had been where he says he was when he says he was, that this is as close as we have ever been to a dictator and will ever get to a dictator. And I remember he said, this is Thucydides, you have to do this. So I said, well, I think I need to see what material you have. So within 45 minutes, a manuscript had been delivered to my apartment, and it was the translation of the manuscript that Li Zhisui had already done in Chinese. And the first scene was the first scene in the book as it was finally published, which is Mao's death. I'd always wondered how Mao died. In September of 1976, I was on my way to teach my first class at Fordham University on Chinese politics when I heard on the radio that Mao had died.
So you were in New York City when you heard about it,
right.
The news.
Right. And I walked into class, and instead of introducing the class, I started introducing Mao. So I sort of worked the whole thing backwards. I started with the end and went back to the beginning in that class. But I'd always wondered how he died. And there it was. Boy, it was quite a dramatic story of his death. So,
in other words, when you first heard about the book, and there was a manuscript,
yes.
And then Dr. Li Zhisui, Chairman Mao's personal physician, by that time he had moved to the United States.
Right.
He lived in Illinois, Carroll Stream, right?
Carroll Stream? Yes, that is. I'm trying to remember.
It is a suburb in the Chicago area, since I live in Chicago.
Okay. And it's also far enough away. At that time there was a limit on how far outside of consular areas the Chinese officials could go. So this was outside the consular area. It was a
Oh,
place
that's
where
interesting.
legally Chinese officials in the United States could not visit him.
Also, I did not realize there's that limitation.
There was still at that time. I think
There
it's-
was-
I think it doesn't exist anymore.
It doesn't exist anymore. Oh, I see, the Carol Stream. So, in other words, that he had a Chinese manuscript. He had written down
Right.
what he wanted to say,
Right.
and then somebody, a Chinese professor,
Yes,
he translated that from Chinese to English.
exactly. And that was what was given to Jason Epstein.
So what was your role in the book? Because there has been some confusion. For years, I thought that you translated Dr. Li Zhishui's book, and I read somewhere else. They said that the book was translated by a Chinese professor, and you edited it. And then I heard some other version saying that you actually collaborated with Dr. Li Zhishui. So what is the correct version?
So I would say it's a long story, but I think when we began, there was a manuscript. Jason Epstein thought it would be very useful for somebody who had skill and experience interviewing Chinese to go through the whole story with him and supplement and augment what Li Zhishui had said. And I think when we started out, we really didn't know how much he was going to have to say and how much more material he would be able to bring us. So as time went on, the manuscript kept getting thicker and thicker, and my role in the manuscript became more and more important, I think. So just at some point during the course of the writing, what I was doing is I was going to Carol Stream, interviewing Li Zhishui for a couple of weeks, coming back, writing a chapter or two, sending the chapter or two on to Jason Epstein and getting his comments on it, and then going back, and it went sort of back and forth over a period of well over a year. And I think it was about 4 years between the time I came into the project and the time the book was published. But at some point along the way, at least me, Jason Epstein, Andy, began to realize that what I was doing was much more than an editor would do. So this was discussed between me and Andy and Jason Epstein, and I have a letter from Jason Epstein saying that he agrees to make me sort of co-author of the book with our names equal size.
Equal size on the cover.
Equal size, pending the approval of Li Zhishui. And I wanted to get that approval right away. Jason Epstein said, "Trust me, Anne." So I trusted him. And when time came, Li Zhishui really did not want to have me share the billing with him. So the title says, "With the editorial assistance of Anne Thurston." And I have to say, professionally, that was truly the worst thing that has ever happened to me. I really don't know if I would have done that book if I had known that I was just going to get that credit. It was just devastating. And I tried to take my name off the cover, and Jason Epstein said, "No, you give the book legitimacy." So yeah, that was a very difficult, for me it was personally very, very difficult.
I totally sympathize with the situation as a translator or a co-author with other books and myself. You always want to be recognized for the tremendous efforts you sometimes put into a book.
Right.
So just to clarify your situation, which means that when you got the manuscript, the English manuscript, it was not publishable in certain ways.
Exactly.
And then you literally just read the whole thing as your background, and then you went back to interview
Right.
Dr. Li Zhishui.
Exactly.
So when you conducted your interview, did you have any? Did you tape the whole conversation?
No, I never taped. That's interesting. I never taped, and it's only very recently that I've started taping interviews. Mainly because I found taping Chinese. At the time there was real tape. There was something sitting on the table going around, and people would stop. This is my experience with many Chinese. They wanted to hear the tape, and then they would hear it, and they didn't like the way they sounded. They wanted to change what they said. They didn't like the sound of their voice. So I decided it was much better just to use notes. So I learned how to take very good notes in sort of my own personal shorthand.
When you conducted the interview, so was it in Chinese or in English? Because Dr. Li Zhisui studied abroad
Right.
for several years, right?
Right. So we did it both in Chinese and in English. Often we would start off in the morning in English, and then as he got tired of using English, he would switch into Chinese. So we went back and forth between Chinese and English. And his English, I think he understood English fine. There was no problem. He did speak English. His spoken English was not as good as his listening English.
Right. Did he approve the notes? Did you share the notes with him?
I never shared the notes with him, but he certainly saw the manuscript. He saw the results of the conversations we'd had. So he didn't see the notes, but he saw what I wrote after.
I see. Because the
Of course
reason
he saw that, yeah.
he saw that.
So
The
he
reason
had
I'm-
to read every word in it.
And the reason I'm asking this is I think the Chinese translator once claimed that the editor of the Random House tried to sensationalize the book by adding information of which Dr. Li Zhisui did not approve. And saying, like, for example, the Random House editor paid more attention to Mao's various sexual relationships or the sexual proclivities, and then which Dr. Li Zhisui did not like, or he did not intend his book to be that sensationalized.
So, I mean, I think there is some truth to that. But I think that the editor would not want to use the word sensationalize. But yes, I think that he wanted those stories told. I will say that at the end of when the book was fully written and sort of fully approved at least by Jason Epstein, any book has to go through a sort of legal vetting.
Okay.
And in a legal vetting, there was some concern about revealing names of women with whom Mao may have been involved. And so we did go through the manuscript and remove a lot of names and to avoid any
potential legal
exactly,
troubles.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Another one of the claims that Dr. Li Zhisui said before he passed away, he said that the actual book actually only contained part of what he provided you, and then there were a large part that you deleted without his knowledge. Is that true?
So first of all, I never did anything without his knowledge. He approved every word in that book.
Okay.
I am sure that there's a lot of information that isn't in there because you're telling a story from beginning to end, and there was a lot of material perhaps that was extraneous that wasn't part of the story. So you can't say everything in a book. So probably if I were to go back and look at my notes, I would find things that aren't in the book. But that doesn't necessarily mean it was deliberately taken out. It was just, you have a story to tell, and you can't tell everything. So he did have the idea, I think, of writing a second book. But the reality, in my experience, is when you write a book like this and you think, well, I've left some things out, I'll write a second book. It doesn't work. I mean, it's the first book, and that's got the really gist of the story and the most important part of the story in there. But you can't tell everything.
So you're saying that the stuff you have deleted is not something central or important to the book.
Yeah, so I wouldn't even say I've deleted anything.
You've
I've
just left out.
There's no deliberate deleting, I think.
Oh,
It's
I
just,
see.
Here's the story.
Did not use
and
certain
you don't use all of the material.
material.
Sure, and anybody who does research has to know that you don't use all the material.
Right.
In fact, I discovered with PhD students, one of their problems is they want to put everything in. But not everything needs to be in. If you want to tell a story and make a point, you don't need everything.
I guess his claims imply that he probably has a lot more important stuff wants to tell, but during the editorial process, sometimes it's not selected or anything.
So I think I would probably disagree with. I think that the important part is all in there, really. But I think lots of people like Li Zhisui writing their story feel that way. It's not an unusual phenomenon to think that I didn't tell everything I still need to say more. I have a second book. But the point is, and I think that the author and the publisher have different different goals. The publisher wants a book that a large public is going to read.
Exactly.
And the author wants to tell everything. And those two goals are not always complementary.
So when you first approached Dr. Li Zhisui, did it ever occur to you that the material gave you is not authentic or anything like that?
So after I spoke with Jason Epstein, and he's saying, I hope you will do this book. I said, well, first of all, I have to see the manuscript. Within 45 minutes, I had the manuscript. I read it, and then I said, well, I have to meet this man. I have to know that he's credible. Now, I also knew at the time that Jason Epstein had done his own background research. He had talked, for instance, to Winston Lord, who was the American ambassador to China, and who verified that this man was who he said he was. And also, there's nothing private about the fact that he was Mao's private doctor. It's in the announcements of Mao's death.
Right.
But I felt I had to meet him to make sure that I knew that he was who he said he was, and also that I'd be able to understand his Chinese. I really wanted to know that I would be able to communicate with him, and there was never a shred of doubt. And the reason there was not a shred of doubt is he was still living his life in what they call Group 1. I mean, he was still fighting the battles of remember the staff around Mao, where he was sort of playing staff members against each other. And so there was a lot of sort of tension around within the group of people who worked most closely with him. And he was still fighting those battles. He still hadn't gotten over it. So there was no doubt in my mind ever. And of course he had scads of pictures. He
had lots of pictures.
Sure, yeah. He had lots of pictures. His two sons both lived in Carroll Stream too, and they remembered they shared their experiences of growing up inside Zhongnan High. So yeah, there was never any doubt. And I still don't, that's something I've never doubted. I don't think even for a second.
So, what was it like to work with him?
He knew that he had a story to tell, and he actually knew pretty much how to tell it. I think the other thing that was probably important to me is that at some point he lost faith in Mao. I think if I were trying to tell the story of somebody who had always loved and respected Chairman Mao, that I would have found it a bit more difficult. But his process of describing how he became disillusioned with Mao, I think, while he was very close to Mao, I think it also reflects a process of disillusionment that many other Chinese went through too. So that was a very credible part of the book.
What do you find so compelling about the book, from your perspective?
I think the one thing that I feel I learned from that book that I hadn't really thought about before, well, first of all, just let me say that when I first started the book and I handed in the first part of it to Jason Epstein, the first part after Mao's death, which was sort of a description of life in Zhongnan High, he said, "This doesn't work, think power." And so immediately I thought, okay, Mao is the emperor. That's who he is. He's living in Zhongnan High. He's living in Qianlong's compound, right?
Right.
And once I realized that Mao was the emperor, whatever his ideology, I sort of understood Mao, and everything else about Mao made sense. So to me, then the next question is, but what about Li Zhisui? How do you accept this for so long? Because I think you can't survive next to a dictator for so many years without violating your own personal ethics. So I think that was something that was troubling, but understandable. And I finally concluded that Mao wouldn't have been possible without the political culture surrounding him. People really did adulate Mao. That wasn't false. That wasn't fake. So it's very hard to understand that political culture. Now, Chinese have also pointed out to me, well, if one part of the political culture is that we all adulated Mao, what do we do about 1989? What about when we all took to the streets in protest?
Right.
And yeah, the answer is it's very complicated, and there's on the one hand and on the other hand. Well, the one thing I will say is that, and it's in the book, I think, this 1989 happened before the book was published. And Li Zhisui said very clearly in the book that if he had been in China at the time, he would have gone right along with the criticisms against the students, and he would have taken the side of the
The students' protest.
whether he believed it or not.
Right. So, to clarify one issue, so you started working on the book in 1990.
I think it was 1991.
1991. So that was right after the students' protest movement in 1989.
Right. I was in China in 1989, and
Right.
I stayed in China for a year after that, and then came back. And I think I spent a year in New York, and then I moved to Washington, D.C.
Right. So, but I have heard that when Dr. Li Zhisui first conceptualized the book, and he wanted this book to be a personal memoir. The focus of the book is a personal memoir. And then, in the end, we read it, it's more like the private life of Chairman Mao. And then the subheading is his personal memoir. How did you, during the process, right, how did you reconcile these two?
I didn't have to reconcile it. I didn't have to reconcile it because when the book came to me, it was the private life of Chairman Mao.
Oh.
So that I didn't have to reconcile that. So to me, actually, the surprise was that I was learning so much about Li Zhisui, writing The Private Life of Chairman Mao. It was also very much a book about him, definitely a book about him.
So when you co-authored the book or collaborated with him, you had that in mind. It was a personal journey. It was his story, rather than was a story of Mao.
But the book, but the first manuscript, whatever title it was, to me the title was The Private Life of Chairman Mao.
Oh, I see.
So I started with that. So I was more surprised about learning so much about Li Zhisui than I was about The Private Life of Chairman Mao. Right? So.
That's great. And you mentioned about professional ethics. I know that after the book came out, there's been a lot of criticism saying that as Mao's personal physician, there was the patient and the physician confidentiality issue. And now he just publicized this whole thing about Mao. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think that those are good criticisms. I mean, it's true. It was a violation of the ethic between a doctor and his patient. But this patient was Mao Zedong, who was the leader of 3 billion people. Who had, I think, led China in many very, very wrong directions. He was a very, very, not just a public figure in China, but he was a worldwide figure. And he may have violated those ethics, but in the, is there, I don't know that I could argue this, but you could argue that there was a higher ethic involved, which is to reveal the reality of a dictatorship.
I guess somebody, because he's such a public figure, it was in the public interest to know about something like that, I guess.
Yeah.
But
and I have to say that many Chinese have come up to me and said, I completely changed their mind about Mao. Not I personally, but that book completely changed their mind about Mao. They had worshipped him until they read that. And of course, some of them still want to know, was it really true?
That's what some part of my questions, it seems like. Go ahead.
I think it was true. I mean, my personal view is that's as close to Chairman Mao as we will ever get. And I'm sure that there are mistakes of fact in the book, in terms of when things happened, where they happened, who met whom when. But I think that the underlying truth of that book is real. That's true.
I think that when I first read the book, 1995, and soon after the book came out, that was the question I raised: is how much was true? To me, it's like there were certain anecdotes about Mao didn't want to brush his teeth, and he compared his teeth to those of the tiger, saying why the tigers did never brush their teeth, but they're so sharp. I said, how?
But that's hard to make up, right?
No, that's what I figured. One of the key issues that with me was he said that he used to keep a journal every day.
Yes.
And then in the 1970s, and then the head of the secretary or somebody told him was very dangerous or something. He burned all the journals. So that my first question was when I read the book is how credible his stories were. How sometimes our memories are not completely reliable.
That's right.
So did you run into the same issue?
Yes. So yes, absolutely. The first thing to be said about Li Zhisui is that he really did have a very good memory. And I think there's a reason for his memory, and that is because every day when he met Mao, Mao said, "Is there any news?" And he was asking the same question of everybody else on his staff. And so everybody had to report the news to Mao accurately, because otherwise you get in real trouble. You get kicked from the circle. So your mind gets trained to sort of remember in a way that you and I think, don't have to remember day to day. But I also think that however good your memory is, it's fallible. And I think his memory was fallible. I had at the same time a research assistant working with all of the checking as much as could be checked against published facts about Mao. So we've had, first of all, the party history, so you can check lots of dates and places through that. But then there are press reports. So there were times when we often found discrepancy between one person's story and Li Zhisui's story. And I would often ask him about those discrepancies, and sometimes he would say, "Oh, yes, that's right. It was such and such a time, or it was such and such a person." And other times he would say, "No, I'm going to stick by the way I see it." So it is his personal view. I think the underlying truth, the underlying story is absolutely fundamentally true, but I would certainly concede that there are certainly going to be some errors of fact, place, date, person in some parts of it.
You did an introduction, right?
I did an introduction. It was taken out. That was another thing. My introduction was taken out of the book.
Didn't you, at a certain point, I heard that when you describe his relationship with Mao, you describe him as a butler to some...
Well, I said he is, so I can't remember exactly how I explained it, but in any sort of situation where you have a very high level person and servants around, the servants are seeing things that other people don't have, and as the butler in Remains of the Day, which is one of my favorite.
That's Ishiguro's book, The Remains of the Day.
Yeah. So I think I sort of saw him as the butler in Remains of the Day, which I think he did not like.
I kind of like it. I think it captures very well the intricate relationship between him and Mao. So I went to one of his lectures. When I was in Chicago, he gave a lecture at Loyola University. And then I think 2 months later, now I suddenly heard that he died. And then the first thing came to my mind was he assassinated?
Yes.
And then some of other friends, of course, they were very superstitious. They said Moscow came to get him. So, jokes aside, I think that there's been a lot of rumors or some speculation, or there's been some conspiracy theories saying that he was killed.
Right.
So what do you think?
So I've heard both of those things, and I've also heard Chairman Mao killed him from Chairman Mao's heaven.
Right.
And I don't believe that any of that for a minute. And for my own personal explanation is, he was 72 years old. He had not been an active man. He didn't go out and play golf every day, or he didn't take particularly good care of himself. He felt very conflicted about doing the book. He knew he had a great story. He wanted to tell that story, but he knew that that story was not going to be well received at all by the leadership in China. So he was certainly worried about that. So I say he died of his own contradictions. He just, the book came out, then suddenly he was talking. He'd been a recluse almost while the book was being done, and then suddenly he's in the spotlight. He's going around. He's talking to various audiences. He's traveling.
They must have organized a lot of book tours and stuff.
Yeah.
I'm sure he must have confronted a lot of Mao's supporters or?
I don't know.
You don't know? Okay.
I don't know. I mean, my sense is probably that the audiences. Well, you were in one of those audiences. I was actually not in the States at that time.
You were not. You were in China.
Yeah.
I see.
So I mean, I'm assuming that he was speaking to academic audiences who were interested in China and not necessarily people who were loyalists of Chairman Mao.
You think that he was struggling with all different issues and with the stress that also caused?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was really under. He had to have been under a lot of psychological stress. Yeah.
That's at least Dr. Thurston has clarified this issue for us.
Yeah, well, I certainly do not believe for a minute that anybody killed him.
Because, you know, it was so sudden that I saw him, like, he was very healthy, and he was talking about how Mao did not take care of his own health, and how, you know, I just assumed that he would know how to do it himself.
That's a very good point. That's a
right.
very good point.
And he suddenly died of, actually he died at a heart attack, right? Exactly, that's what he warned Mao against, that kind of the illness.
So I can understand why some people thought that Mao might have had a role in all that, but I think not.
Right. But anyway, so after the book came out, were you banned from going to China, or did you receive any threats or anything like that?
So actually, I was in China when the book came out, and
did they know about it? Did the authorities know about your involvement in the book?
Actually, I think probably they didn't, but I do remember my journalist friends telling me about a press conference that was held, and one of the foreign journalists asked the representative about the book, and the answer was that the book is sheer fabrication written with ulterior motives. But no, I don't know how long it took for them to figure out that I had anything to do with the book, but I went to China for many years afterwards before they would read it again.
It hardly had an impact.
No.
Okay.
No. And in fact, I mean, I actually was contacted by some Chinese representatives in the United States, and I said, you may not want to talk to me because I was I worked with the private life of Chairman Mao, and they said, oh no, we understand, we think you were duped. They thought that I was duped.
You were duped into doing this.
Right, yeah.
Wow.
Well, they didn't say into doing it, just I was duped. And I may have been duped by Jason Epstein.
Jason Epstein,
the editor
at Random House.
Yeah.
So during your private conversations with your friends in China, Chinese friends, what were their reaction to the book?
I would say that their reaction was very positive. My friends were basically very liberal people, right? So I remember one time when Wen Wu was introduced to me, she got down on her knee and took my hand and kissed it for writing that book. And people have said, well, when we finally get political reform in China, that book will be the starting point. We look back and see that book as the starting point of political reform in China, because you told.
I think it had a major impact after it was translated into Chinese. I think it was that Chinese Times, the publishing house, they published it. And I was told that it sold 400,000 copies in the first run or something. So it had a tremendous impact. For a while, I think when I traveled back to China, they wanted me to sneak back some the banned books. One of them was was the Chinese version of your book. I want to clarify one more thing. So the Chinese version, there was also some complaint that the Chinese version was a direct translation of your English version, rather than Dr. Li Zhishui's original Chinese manuscript.
That's right. Exactly. Yes. The Chinese version, as it appeared, as it was published, was a translation of the English version.
If Dr. Li Zhishui had a Chinese version, they would have published his original in Chinese, but they didn't do that. They translated your version into Chinese.
Okay. So you see you see two different Chinese. You see two different translators.
Oh, there are two different translators.
Well, there's one is when I mentioned the first manuscript that I got from Jason Epstein. That was translated by the American Chinese professor.
Okay.
Then the book came out in English, and when it went to the Chinese publication, it was then translated. That book was translated into Chinese. So I think they had to give everybody credit for what they had done, but it's very unclear, I guess, if you see that there are two translators.
But there
Who
was,
translated what?
but one thing is clear: we don't have a Chinese version that was written by
Li
Dr.
Zhisui.
Li
That's
Zhisui.
absolutely true. Absolutely true.
That's great.
Well, to the extent that the book that was published in English is Me and Li Zhisui. I mean, that's still his book, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right. That was. But I mean,
but
like.
that was not in Chinese. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
What I meant was, if people have been talking about, he had a Chinese manuscript,
Yeah.
but not that one. But it was a translation of what you and Dr. Li Zhisui had done.
Right,
Great.
right, right.
So.
I have heard that some people have gone through that page by page, and I think there are discrepancies.
Was that because of
don't know.
their lack of understanding of English, or it was some kind of deliberate attempts to remove something? I heard there was, in one version, they removed some parts that are relating to Deng Xiaoping.
Oh, really? Oh.
That's what I read, but I have not read the Chinese version.
Yeah, I don't know. And I don't remember that he ever said anything unfriendly to Deng Xiaoping.
Right, I see. That's but regardless, your book has such a major impact. Great.
Well, I will say personally that book, it was the hardest thing, not to have the recognition that I felt I deserved was the hardest thing I've ever faced in my professional life. But I also stand by the book. I think that 100 years from now, if somebody goes and reads that book, they will understand that that's the closest thing you'll ever get to really understand Mao and Chinese politics.
Especially during the last 22 years of Mao's life, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. And what's your latest project? I know that you just published a book about the Dalai Lama's brother, right?
Yes. So I say my role in life is listening to Chinese stories. Now my role in life has expanded to hearing Tibetan stories too. And as a result, actually, of having written The Private Life of Chairman Mao, I was asked to work with the Dalai Lama's older brother, Gyalo Dendrit, to do his autobiography. And that has now been published under the title The Noodle Maker of Kalimpong. And it's not the story, it's not quite the same story as the Private Life of Chairman Mao by a long shot, but I think you get a pretty good sense of what Tibetan life was like.
But why did you focus on his brother?
It was because his brother wanted to write his autobiography.
Why? What is so fascinating about his stories?
What's so fascinating about his story is that he is, even within his own family, he's very unusual in that he was sent to China to study. So he studied in Nanjing under the sponsorship of Chiang Kai-shek, went back to Tibet, and then became a very important person within the sort of political structure of Tibet. And also, after the Dalai Lama fled to India, he played a very significant role in the Tibetan government in exile. He also had been contacted in the mid-1950s by the CIA and was sort of the behind-the-scenes leader of the resistance movement in Tibet. So he played a very important role for that period of Tibetan history.
I think we probably should do another segment on this new book. At least on the cover of this new book, and your name appears side by side with the brother. And I saw this is an Indian version. I've also had the American version, and I hope you are happy with the book. Now I've heard that it's being translated into Chinese.
Yes.
It's being distributed internally.
As I understand it, I have a version of it in Chinese, and it is definitely an internal version.
It's an internal version.
Yes.
I see.
Yeah.
But anyway, and I hope that readers, when you get the chance to read this book, and I am going to read it on my way home. And thank you so much, Dr. Thurston, for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed
Great.
it.
Great. Thank you.